Hey everyone, welcome back to Sip and Talk. We're looking at quite a stack of information today, pulling together some really complex and honestly sometimes difficult topics.
Yeah, it really seems to center around power, borders, and just how differently people can see the same thing.
Exactly. Clashing viewpoints, sometimes colliding viewpoints.
But the information itself covers a lot of ground. We've got updates on economic policy, trade stuff, then some really disturbing reports about recent violence right here in the U.S.
Yeah.
And then looking at attitude, towards the U.S., towards Taiwan. And finally, something very specific to today, June 4th, a major historical event.
So our mission, as always, is to try and cut through some of the noise, pull out the key points, and really help you understand what might be going on beneath the surface.
Trying to unpack the different layers, the complexities in these reports.
Okay, let's get into it.
It is striking how these different threads trade, these domestic incidents, history, they all seem to touch those core ideas. Power dynamics, identity, how stories get told.
Absolutely. And speaking of power and clashes, let's start with that trade policy information. It mentions a pretty confident negotiation style, aiming to make other countries yield.
Right. The material frames this as part of that, America First approach.
Yeah.
The goal ostensibly is boosting American industry, maybe tackling trade deficits.
Right.
But the reports suggest the way it's being done is making allies nervous. It could be damaging trust, maybe even hurting their economies unexpectedly. It's like you aim at one target, but sometimes your friends get caught in the crossfire.
Makes sense. So what are the specific recent actions? What tensions are highlighted?
Well, the big concrete step recently was doubling those steel and aluminum tariffs up to 50%. 50%, yeah. Effective May 30th. And that's really ratcheted up tensions, especially with the European Union and China. Talks seem pretty slow right now, according to the report.
And there are legal challenges involved, too. The courts are weighing in.
Yes, and this has a really interesting layer. Raises questions about, presidential power. Some courts have actually ruled certain tariffs unlawful.
Which ones?
Specifically, some applied under the IEPA, that's the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, related to fentanyl. The argument is they might go beyond what the president is legally allowed to do.
Okay.
The administration is appealing, naturally. There was an appeals court ruling mentioned June 2nd, and the government's response is due around June 9th. This whole legal fight could potentially end up at the Supreme Court, so lots of uncertainty there.
Right. So beyond the international friction, what about the economic impact here? What do the sources say?
Well, they definitely highlight pressure on businesses. Small businesses, for instance, might have to cut employee hours because costs are going up. And specific companies get mentioned, like Gap. They're expecting something like $300 million in tariff expenses. They're planning to diversify their supply chain, get less reliant on one place by 2026.
Wow, $300 million.
Yeah. And ELF Beauty gets 75% of its supply from China. They're facing these huge 55% tariffs, but apparently are saying they'll stick it out.
And for regular people, consumers.
Prices could go up. Steel tariffs might affect things like canned food costs. The premium on aluminum is rising, too. It all adds to that inflationary pressure we feel.
Yeah, you see it trickle down. So how are other countries reacting beyond just, saying they're unhappy?
They're signaling concrete actions. The EU expressed strong regret, obviously, but they're also threatening accelerated retaliation if there's no deal by July 9th. Their current pause on tariffs ends July 14th. That's the key date.
Okay.
China called the tariff hike a severe violation, promised a firm response. That could mean things like export controls on AI chips, maybe revoking some U.S. student visas, even using their leverage with rare earth minerals.
Very stuff.
Very. Reports mention President Trump is apparently waiting for a call with Xi Jinping about all this. And Canada. They seem focused on boosting their own internal trade, trying to insulate themselves a bit.
So many dates and deadlines coming up. June 5th for proposals. The G7 summit is mid-June. Then those July dates.
Exactly. It paints a picture of pretty slow progress on the trade front overall. Just a framework deal with the UK so far. Lots of uncertainty, really depending on how these legal battles turn out and what happens in negotiations.
Okay. Let's shift gears now. It's quite a pivot to a much more sobering topic that's also covered here. These disturbing accounts of recent attacks in the U.S. apparently linked to extremist views.
Yes. The material details two very specific, very recent incidents. One in Boulder, Colorado, and one in Washington, D.C.
Can you walk us through what the reports say happened?
Okay, the Boulder incident was June 1st on Pearl Street Mall. It happened during an event for Israeli hostages called Run for Their Lives. A man 45 years old named Mohammed Sabri Solomon. He allegedly disguised himself as a gardener.
Okay.
Reports say he shouted, "Free Palestine!" and then attacked the crowd with Molotov cocktails and some kind of homemade flamethrower.
Oh my...
12 people injured, 8 hospitalized. Ages 52 to 88, some with really severe burns. He apparently told investigators he'd planned it for a year, targeted what he called a Zionist group, and wanted to kill all Zionists. The FBI is calling it a targeted terror attack and a federal hate crime. Condemned across the board Netanyahu, Trump, Governor Polis in Colorado.
Just horrific. And the incident in D.C.?
That was May 21st outside the Capitol Jewish Museum. 2 Israeli embassy employees, Yaron Lashinsky and Sarah Lynn Milgram, were shot and killed after an event there.
Right.
The suspect allegedly shouted "End Zionists" right before. He reportedly had social media posts criticizing Israel and U.S. actions in Gaza. A man originally from Chicago was arrested, charged with murder. Again, the FBI labeled it a targeted terror attack, linking the motive to anti-Semitism and anti-Israel views. Security was stepped up afterwards.
Deeply troubling accounts. The information then tries to explore some broader points about immigrants and radicalization. And it's crucial, like you said, to understand the nuances here, avoid generalizing. What does it say about historical cases versus typical reasons people come here?
Right. It does mention a few historical examples. Ramzi Youssef, 1993 World Trade Center. Tashfin Malik in San Bernardino, who came legally. Seflo Saipov, the NYC truck attack via the diversity visa. Just a few examples cited. But it quickly pivots to stress the usual reasons people immigrate are overwhelmingly positive or driven by need. You know, economic opportunity, escaping war or persecution, joining family, established visa programs, things like that.
Okay, so those are the motivations for coming. But then it looks at why some individuals might sort of turn towards extremism after they arrive. What factors are suggested?
Several things are highlighted. Social isolation, maybe an identity crisis. If you face language barriers, cultural hurdles, discrimination, it can make it hard to integrate, leave you feeling alienated. And that vulnerability can then be exploited. Radicalization channels, especially online ISIS propaganda, is mentioned. Anger at U.S. foreign policy is another factor cited, particularly actions in the Middle East. And then personal factors. Psychological issues, maybe economic hardship, even a criminal background could play a role.
So it's complex, a mix of personal situations and external pushes, potentially. Which brings up another point raised. Why might someone develop this strong dislike for the U.S., even after choosing to come here?
The material offers a few possibilities. One is a clash with liberal U.S. values. Religious freedom, gender equality, free speech might be hard to accept if you come from a very conservative society.
Okay.
Experiencing discrimination or prejudice here is another big factor mentioned that can breed resentment. Then there's the influence of those extremist ideologies we talked about, actively painting the U.S. as, the evil empire. And just frustration if things don't work out as hoped, if the economic success or social acceptance isn't there. That disappointment can curdle into hostility towards the whole system.
It's a difficult picture. So if someone feels that strongly, that negatively, why doesn't the information suggest they just leave?
Yeah, it addresses that. It gives a few reasons why leaving might not happen. Practical barriers are huge. Maybe nowhere safe to return to, no money to move, fear of persecution back home. Then there are strategic reasons for those with violent intent. Staying in the U.S. might be seen as more impactful for an attack, maybe easier to access things like firearms. And third, ideology. They might see staying and fighting the enemy from within as their mission.
Really unsettling possibilities presented there. Okay, let's pivot again. There's another section here that looks at a different context, Taiwan, but draws some interesting parallels.
Yeah.
It discusses the attitudes of some mainland Chinese spouses there, the Liu Pei.
That's right. It talks about this group, around 360,000 of them in Taiwan as of 2023 data. And the point raised is that some within this group are perceived, maybe through surveys or reports, as holding negative views about Taiwan's democratic system, perhaps favoring unification with China or at least closer ties.
And why did they go to Taiwan in the first place, according to this? Any overlap with the U.S. reasons?
Some overlap, yeah. The most common reason is marriage, marrying a Taiwanese citizen, family ties. But also, like the U.S. examples, seeking better economic opportunities, higher living standards, healthcare, education compared to the mainland. Social stability in Taiwan is also mentioned.
Understandable reasons. But then, why might some come to dislike Taiwan's politics or system after arriving? What does the information suggest?
It points to a few things. Big one is political ideology. If you're raised in the mainland system with that education, the one China propaganda, it can clash really hard with Taiwan's vibrant democracy, its free press, open criticism of the CCP.
You're right, a fundamental difference.
Exactly. Then, social integration issues, maybe facing discrimination, stereotypes like being automatically seen as pro-CCP, sometimes policy things like historically longer waits for Taiwanese ID cards compared to other immigrants, and finally, that background expectation of eventual unification pushed by Chinese nationalism, the two sides, one family narrative, that can make it hard to fully embrace Taiwan as separate political identity.
It sounds like that ideological clash. Again, similar themes, but a different place. So following the parallel, if they feel that way, why don't they just go back to China? What reasons are given?
Again, similar themes to the U.S. discussion. Strong family ties in Taiwan. Their kids are Taiwanese citizens. They've built lives there, have roots.
Practical anchors.
Yeah. Plus, Taiwan generally offers better healthcare, education, social welfare than the mainland. Big practical factors. Economic issues, too. Finding work back home might be tough, and dealing with the hukou household registration system in China could be complicated.
And anything else?
One interesting point mentioned. Some might believe that staying in Taiwan actually allows them to try and influence its politics towards closer ties with the mainland, sort of working towards their ideological goals from within.
Fascinating. How practical factors keep people rooted even amidst ideological discomfort. So what's the main comparison the information draws between the U.S. extremist examples and these Taiwan spouse examples?
The core similarities identified are that sense of identity conflict, feeling torn between your background and the system you're in, the role of external influence extremist propaganda versus Chinese state nationalism, and there's very real practical reasons preventing departure, family, economics, legal hurdles.
And the key difference is noted.
The main difference is obviously the motivation and behavior. Violence and terror versus nonviolent political or ideological expression. Also, the degree of integration challenge might differ. The U.S. is super diverse, while Lupe share language and culture with Taiwan but face that stark political divide. And the goals destroying a system versus trying to change its political direction. It really highlights how these issues of identity, integration, belief, they play out so differently depending on the context.
That comparison is really insightful.
Okay.
Now, let's turn to a date that resonates strongly today, June 4th. The material includes a very detailed account of the 1989 Tiananmen Square events.
Yes, and this section presents those two starkly contrasting perspectives. The official Chinese government narrative, and then this incredibly powerful eyewitness account from a foreign reporter who was right there.
Let's start with the official Chinese view, as presented. How do they frame what happened?
According to the material, the official line calls it a political turmoil or a counter-revolutionary riot. They say it was started by a few people trying to overthrow the Communist Party and the socialist system, a threat to stability.
Okay.
They acknowledge it began with student mourning for Hu Yaobang, but claim it was exploited by people with ulterior motives, maybe even external forces, trying to push for a peaceful evolution away from communism. The government says using the military and martial law on June 3rd and 4th was necessary to restore order because they faced violent resistance, burning vehicles, attacks on soldiers.
And their official casualty numbers.
The information confirms China has never released specific official numbers. Reports from back in '89 mentioned maybe 200 civilians and dozens of soldiers killed or injured. But crucially, they maintain most casualties happened outside Tiananmen Square itself, in other parts of Beijing like Muxidi. They deny a large-scale massacre happened in the square.
Okay, that's the official narrative. Now, the eyewitness account, this is from BBC reporter Kate 80. What did she report seeing? This sounds intense.
It's incredibly raw and completely different. She describes seeing soldiers literally firing from their lorries on June 3rd. Thousands of people still on the streets shouting, "Stop the killing." The sheer horror of it. She talks about feeling this absolute duty to bear witness because, as she put it, we'd seen it in all its terribleness.
Yeah.
She describes how the atmosphere changed, from students debating to just ordinary people joining in, hearing the shooting start late June 2nd, early June 3rd, reporting this all back via a landline phone. No satellites or smartphones then, describing burning trucks, buses, constant gunfire, seeing troops firing indiscriminately into crowds. There's this chilling detail she mentions turning around, and the man who was right next to her was just gone, dead on the ground. She describes helping a woman who had been shot, taking her to a children's hospital nearby, and the scene there was like out of a bad movie, floor literally running with blood, casualties flooding in every few seconds on bikes, rickshaws, 40 serious injuries, 2 dead in just 20 minutes while she was there, staff in tears, bodies just slung on the floor.
Unimaginable.
And despite this, she says thousands of people still wouldn't back down. She felt this immense pressure because she didn't see other Western TV crews right there, knowing China would deny it. She saw young people singing the Internationale amid the gunfire. She even describes her own panic during one volley of shots, 2 people killed right near her, people begging her, "Tell the world." Getting the tape out was another nightmare, running through streets, seeing bullets hitting the pavement like little red sparks. A man cannoned into her, he'd been shot, the bullet grazed her arm. Having to scale a hotel wall like a lizard, fighting off figures she thought were security trying to stop her. They ended up making 5 copies of the tape and smuggling them out via different people flying to different countries just to make sure the footage, the evidence, got out.
The contrast is just stark. Why does the material say China works so hard to prevent its own people from discussing these events?
It boils down to control and stability, mainly. The government fears open discussion would question the party's authority, maybe spark new unrest. They need to control the historical narrative, frame it purely as suppressing a riot.
How do they do that?
Strict censorship is key. The Great Firewall blocking websites and keywords, deleting online discussions, keeping it out of textbooks and state media. They argue it's about avoiding social division, prioritizing collective stability over revisiting painful history. It's a political logic where the party stability is paramount.
And how does China respond to the kind of evidence provided by reporters like 80?
Well, officially, they stick to denying a massacre in the square itself, though they might acknowledge conflict elsewhere. They often question the foreign evidence, call it biased, fabricated, part of an anti-China plot by hostile forces.
Right.
They restrict journalists, especially around the anniversary, making it hard to even contact survivors or groups like the Tiananmen Mothers. Domestically, they use the information blockade and state media to push their narrative. Internationally, it's diplomacy and dismissing human rights concerns as political interference. The fact 80 is still banned from China. The material notes it shows the CCP's very long memories for those who contradicted their story. Historians, by the way, estimate deaths likely number over 2,000 in Beijing alone, far beyond official claims.
And that iconic image, Tank Man.
Yeah, mentioned as that powerful symbol of defiance, standing alone against the tanks on June 5th, the day after the main crackdown. His fate remains unknown officially, just rumors. 80 noted how quickly that Beijing spring atmosphere vanished, replaced by roundups and harassment of foreign press.
The explanation offered is that the Communist Party has very long memories.
Yeah.
And foreign journalists who report critically on these, sensitive areas, they get labeled as anti-China.
Anti-China for reporting the truth. It just highlights how determined they are to control the history, the narrative, even after all this time, and punish those who challenge it.
Yeah, it speaks to that ongoing battle over memory and truth. For the journalist, it seems she views the ban in a strange way, almost like proof she did her job well, a kind of badge of honor for exposing what they wanted hidden.
So, this deep dive, we've covered a lot. The buildup of protests, the government's reaction, the sheer horror witnessed firsthand, the bravery of ordinary people, the fight to get the truth out, and the long shadow it casts, even today, with the state trying to control the memory.
It's a really stark illustration of what can happen when dissent meets an authoritarian state that chooses force, especially when they frame that dissent as a fundamental threat.
And it really makes you think, why is it important for us, for you listening, to know this history? What does it tell us about power, about controlling information, about courage in the face of overwhelming force?
Yeah, understanding Tiananmen means wrestling with all those pieces. The protesters' ideals, the government's fear and loss of face, the orders given to the army, the historical context, and, crucially, the determination of people like this journalist to make sure it wasn't just forgotten or denied.
Where's the march? Tiananmen's there. Why? I think. My duty.
Global trade frictions, this awful domestic violence driven by ideology, complex questions of identity and belonging in Taiwan, and this incredibly painful, contested historical event.
It really does pull together those threads of power, control, how narratives are shaped and clash. Understanding any of these requires looking from multiple angles.
Absolutely. It shows how different narratives get constructed and sometimes fiercely controlled. So maybe a final thought for you, our listeners, to chew on. Given everything we've explored, the conflicting accounts of trade impacts, the motivations behind violence, the reasons people stay in places despite disagreeing with the system, the starkly different versions of major historical events, how do you navigate information in a world where fact can seem so dependent on who's talking and where they stand?
It's definitely the challenge of our times, isn't it? How to weigh different sources, different perspectives.
It really is. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive.
Someone says that was the closest China's ever been to true democracy. What do you think? Drop your comments. Catch you next time on Sip and Talk. Bye.